along. Okay. So, right, most of you guys, when we say body comp, you think of stuff like this, right? Or you probably think of the thing on the right, on the bottom. When I say body composition, when most people, what the thing that pops into your head is, right, muscle mass, fat mass, leanness, what do people look like in a particular way? That's okay, right? But if I looked at all of this and I asked you guys, who's the healthiest of these people? Who's at the greatest risk of certain diseases or those kinds of things? You might all arrive at different answers. Okay. You might all arrive at different answers. And so we know from VO2 max, probably the guy, the cross-country runner is probably the healthiest person. He has the highest VO2 max. Okay, but we're going to dig into a little bit about at the end, why do cross-country runners need to have a certain body composition, right? Is it that all of their training makes them look a certain way? Or is it that people that are predisposed to be that way anyway seem to be better at those events, right? Why do sort of offensive and defensive linemen in football tend to be these big, right, muscular people in that particular way? And then what's going on with, you know, with my dude here who has clearly lost some weight and lost some body fat and all of this, okay? So what body comp tells us very simply is, what are you made of? Chemical, anatomical, right? Muscle, fat, amino acids, protein, like whatever you want to break it down into. That's your body comp. Okay. In its sort of most basic form, we can derive from that percent body fat, we can derive from that percent muscle mass, but it really is a way to quantify all of the things that you're made up of. Okay. All of the things that you're made up of. Historically, we arrive at body composition as fat and everything else. Okay. You are made up of basically two giant kind of clusters of things. Fat mass in all of its sort of iterations and locations, and then everything else. Okay. We'll talk about where we get that. Okay. But in recent years, as we've gotten better at doing things with DEXA, with MRI, in some ways even with BIA and some of this stuff, we can break down that non-fat, or it's what we call lean mass, into muscle and water and bone and things like that. That will give us a much more kind of in-depth and clear picture of what are you made up of, and then how might that stuff kind of correspond to everything. Body comp at its most basic is an indicator of your nutritional status. Okay. It is generally going to reflect a balance of calories in, calories out. Right? People that, right, don't get enough to eat, right, which in the US is somewhere between 20-25% of the population, right, has some level of food insecurity and all of these things. If people don't eat enough, it's not about that they don't want to, but they are purposely trying to be that way. They don't. That has an energy balance effect and affects the body composition. Okay. So we'll see about that. We will get into kind of how we separate the body into metabolically active or fat-free mass and inactive, like non-metabolically active tissues. And then is there some evidence, right, that too little muscle, too much fat, too little bone density has some poor health consequences? And the answer, of course, is yes, it does. Okay. But how and why and how we actually arrive at those answers is a little more complicated and a little trickier than you may think. Okay. So we'll start with BMI. I cannot emphasize this enough. BMI is not a measure of body composition. I promise you that will be on the test somewhere. BMI is not a measure of body composition. Okay. It is a measure of size in some way, right? It is calculated as weight in kilograms divided by height in meters squared. Okay? It makes no distinction between what we have historically called overweight, and I apologize for the kind of crassness of the term, but over fat. Okay? But that is how they couch those things. It takes nothing into account about how much muscle you have, how much bone mineral density you have, how much adipose tissue that you have. And so because of that, it is a terrible measure, especially in people that have a lot of muscle. Okay? Muscle weighs more than fat, and so that drives your weight up, but it may not always be a reflection of sort of excess fat. Although in sort of non-weight training, non-athletic groups, especially in older adults, it tends to be. Okay? It tends to be. Body fatness and BMI are only weakly related. We have, years and years and years and years of data. It'll be interesting to see if we continue to do this. But there's a survey that they do every 2 years. It's called the National Health and Nutritional Status Survey. It's called INHANE. It's run by the CDC. And they will have people come in, they get BMI, they make a whole bunch of measures, you answer a bunch of questions. And we have data from hundreds of thousands of people, and they have some people that get a DEXA scan, and when they look at their BMI versus their body composition from DEXA, it actually doesn't correspond now. Okay? The relationship between body fatness and muscle mass and BMI differs between old people and young people. Okay, it's a better reflection of older folks than in younger. Between men and women, okay, because you guys have different intrinsic levels of body fatness and bone mineral density generally. It's really bad in people that are weight trained compared to non-weight trained. Okay, people that weight train have more muscle, which weighs more. They also tend to have greater bone mineral density, which also means their bones weigh more. And so the extent to which their weight reflects sort of excess body fat is really not captured very well in those kind of populations. Okay. However, we do know that BMI in the general population is a really good indicator of health status. If your BMI is over 25, you're at an increased risk of basically dying from anything, having any kind of chronic disease. If your BMI is over 30, at a very significantly increased risk of those. Okay. While it may not be a great reflection in any individual person on a population level, it does tend to be fairly accurate. Or at least it does tend to be fairly predictive. Do you guys understand? Y'all have any talk about that nuance? Anybody in Grant's applied research methods class? Okay. You guys talk about what an association is or anything else in Capstone. Anybody capable of speaking? We lost is the rain sapped our voices? So I think one of the most difficult things, and this causes us a huge amount of problems, I think, just my opinion, is people don't understand science. And they think I saw this on TikTok. I can Google this, therefore I know things as well as the science, right? We get into it's dangerous. Okay. But the idea of associations, right, that things are related, but we cannot say that one thing directly causes something else, right? You calculate a statistical measure called a correlation, right? And so your BMI correlates to overall markers of health status, like your risk of diabetes and cardiovascular disease. And what that tells us is that in a large group of people, that it tends to be that if you have a higher BMI, you have a greater chance of having type 2 diabetes or certain kinds of cancer and that sort of thing. But what people have a hard time wrapping their brain around, and I understand that, right? So what we call anecdotally, that does not mean that any individual person, right? Your BMI is super high, right? but it doesn't mean that you're absolutely going to have high blood pressure, or you're absolutely going to have type 2 diabetes or something like that. So because of that, people are like, well, that didn't happen to me, so the science must not be real, or, it must not kind of indicate that. And so it's this idea that in a very large population, more people than not will tend to kind of fall that way. And that's how we do science. That's how we try to make these informed sort of decisions about stuff like this. And it doesn't always work in every individual person. And as humans, we have a hard time. We're like, I smoked versus my lifespan. I smoked basically a pack of cigarettes a day for 35 straight years, and I don't have lung cancer. So clearly, they have made up all of the data that cigarettes cause lung cancer, right? And both of those things can in fact be true at the same time, right? Just because it didn't happen in you doesn't mean that in the majority of people that did that, right, that there was a thing where that bad things can happen. And that's a hard thing for us to hold in our hand. I don't know that I have a question for you guys about it, but does that make sense? So when I say we don't have data that body composition is related to these kind of poor or different health outcomes, what that means is that as scientists, we don't feel like we have data from enough people to feel comfortable saying, yeah, in general, right, we feel like if your percent body fat is more than X number, that raises your risk 2 times or 3 times or 4 times or something like that. Okay. So, okay. We're really bad at understanding intuitively probabilistic statistics. And so that causes us a lot of trouble. Okay. So here are the BMI ranges. I want you to know the BMI ranges. I know you guys have had these before, right? If you're 18.5 or less, you're considered underweight. And there are poor health outcomes that are associated with being underweight. Okay. That's also can be bad. 18.5 to 24.9 is normal. Okay. 25 to 29.9 is overweight. Anything over 30 is obese. We will sometimes try to sort of have extra categories of obesity, obesity 1, obesity 2, and those things. And as your BMI gets higher and higher, then your chances of sort of poor health outcomes go up. A fascinating thing that we can do, though, is if I take your BMI and I couple that with a simple measure of your waist size, your waist circumference, okay? So guys essentially measure right around where your belly button is. Ladies, we have to find for you guys sort of someplace a little probably above belly button, but because of the Q angle and stuff at your hips, it tends to be a little bit higher. That kind of narrows point as we come up. If we add those in and you have any BMI, but you have a waist circumference over 40 in men or over 35 in women, okay? And it's going to have an even greater predictive value on all of this. And that's because storage of excess fat right here, what we call visceral fat, subcutaneous fat, right here, okay, seems to be the thing that predicts especially diabetes risk, okay, sort of poor gallbladder health, and then with the diabetes risk comes some associated cardiovascular disease risk. So where you actually store excess body fat matters in some ways. Men tend to store it in different places than women, and then kind of as that goes around, we're gonna change our risk factors a little bit. Okay. How do I get? Oh, there we go. So how do we assess body fat? Okay. Just a couple of terms. So I know you guys have already seen all of this, right? Well, we're going to divide you out into metabolically active and inactive components. When we do that, we're going to start by saying you have fat-free mass and fat mass. Okay, fat mass denotes any adipose tissue in your body anywhere. Okay, subcutaneous, intramuscular, okay, everywhere. All of the adipose tissue in your body. Fat-free mass is everything else. Water, protein, minerals, right? Ions, blood, all of them, okay? Red blood cells. That's everything else. So we have different models that attempt to help us separate you into fat-free mass and fat mass, or fat mass and lean mass, depending on how we, the kind of terminology that we use. So there are models that will say we are going to be fat and fat-free, that's two components. There are then models that will have a third component or a fourth component, and what they're doing is they're separating fat-free mass into its individual components. And I'll show you guys some things from there as we go along. Okay? Terms to know. Fat mass represents all lipid or adipose tissue in your body. Essential fat is we all have to have some amount of lipid tissue in our body to stay alive. Okay? We call that essential fat. But we have no idea what that number is. Because the only way we can know that number is I would have to starve you basically until you die. We can figure out right before you die, okay, that was, we crossed that threshold, that was where our number was. Okay? And so we don't really know. We get an estimate by looking at people that are very, very lean. They've done some data in people that are anorexic and they have been forced into extreme levels of weight loss and some things like that, and try to map some of that out. I'll give you guys a little bit of info there. We think, this is important, we think that our best guess in men is it's about 4 or 5%, okay? And in women, it's somewhere between maybe 8 and 10%, okay? If you do skin folds or you do something and some dude ever tells you he has 2% body fat, he's completely full of shit. He does not have 2% body fat, okay? He does not have 2% body fat. The leanest guys you can think of might be in the 7, 8, 10% body fat range if we get a DEXA scan on them. The leanest women you can think of might be in the high teens on a DEXA scan. Okay. So when we say essential fat, I mean, I'm talking, if that number is really, 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 really low in that way. Okay. And so we have to kind of use that as a way to recalibrate. When we do DEXA scans as part of research, we share that information with people. People are very often stunned. They're like, oh my God, my body fat is this percentage. Or like, yeah, you just need to recalibrate like what you're thinking, right? That, you know, anything in a guy under 10% is really, you're not going to be 2%. Anything under like 25% in women, you're very, very weak. You know, in that way. Just because the way we kind of talk about this in popular culture is a little bit incorrect. Okay. Lean body mass is meant to represent all of your fat-free mass plus the essential fat that of course we can't measure. And so again, true lean body mass and essential fat, we don't know what those are. Okay. So when I say lean body mass and we get lean mass from DEXA, it's not actually going to include essential body fat. It's really going to be water, bone, and muscle, kind of everything else in that way. Okay. So here are these models, all right? And I do want you guys to have a sense of the differences here, okay? On the far left would be a model where we're going to break you down into the chemical makeup of all of your tissues, right? You have fat, you have protein from muscles and other tissues, we have carbohydrate, right? So like glycogen and stuff like that that's there, a huge amount of water, and then minerals coming from bones and intracellular signals, all of those things, okay? That's a chemical model. Really, really difficult for us to actually do some sort of chemical analysis of all of you guys in this room. Okay, we have these models, but a lot of that comes from cadavers and it's kind of a theoretical thing. We have an anatomical model, which is going to have adipose tissue, muscle, your various organs, bone, and then kind of everything else that's left over. Okay, these two things, though, are in essence getting at what is fat and then what is everything else. So if you look at the far right, this is the traditional, we call a 2-component model of body composition. Fat mass and then everything else. And so if you look at the chemical model versus the two-component model, right? What it is it's the chemical model is fat, and then those other things are what fat-free mass is made up of. Okay? If you look in the anatomical model, we're calling fat mass adipose tissue, and then the fat-free mass is muscle, organs, bone, and everything else. It's just a way of trying to break down mostly what is made up of and contained in that fat-free mass. Okay? That's where this is going to come from. This is a thing that people used to use called the Beatty two-component model. Again, it further tries to break fat mass down into adipose tissue and essential fat, but of course we can't measure essential fat, so it all kind of becomes worthless in that way. Okay, so as we go through our different ways we measure body composition, I will try to tell you guys this is a two-component model, or this is a 3 or a 4-component model. This is how that model is trying to separate us into different chemicals or anatomical makeups. Okay. Okay. The ways that we know what it is that you're made up of, okay, in you guys are what we call indirect assessments. We're going to make a measure and we're going to guess based upon that measure at what you're made of. It's all a guess. It's a good guess, but it's a guess. Okay? And the reason we have to guess is because the only real way to know what you're made up of is we have to dissect you and weigh out all of your tissues and all of your organs and all of those things. Okay? So that analysis that we do on cadavers is called a direct assessment. Okay, what you guys did in anatomy lab, if you had it here, you did a dissection. If you did the dissection, and then this is the muscle, weigh the muscle, break the muscle down, figure out how much protein is in there. That's what people have done. There is a set of analyses that have been done on sort of reference cadavers over the years. And so we know, and there are various ages, there's men, there's women, unfortunately, kids and older folks, people of sort of a host of ages that are in there, but they do a full direct assessment in those folks. And then, or I guess probably before they did the dissection, they put them in a DEXA scanner, put them in an MRI. They would scan the cadaver and then break everything down. And they use that actual direct assessment to help them calibrate, right, like what goes on with the direct assessment. Kind of a creepy, morbid thing, but this is how we know the things that we know. So there are kind of 4 or 5 kind of big, commonly used indirect measures, and I put BMI on here, but I put the caveat that it's really not assessing the body composition. Okay, so we're going to use a concept called densitometry. We're going to talk about kind of high resolution imaging, MRI and DEXA scans, skin fold thickness, and then bioelectrical impedance. Although to be really, really honest, skin fold and bioelectrical impedance actually rely on the idea of densitometry. They do sort of a double indirect way of doing things. They rely on this idea of densitometry to do their predictions, which is why they're the least accurate sometimes. Okay, so we'll walk through. I'll talk to you guys about all of this. Today was kind of a fun day, right? Anybody see the water somewhere and then you stepped in and then it was deeper than you thought, and you stepped in and then it rose up your shoes and up your pant leg or something farther than you thought, right? You stepping in the water made the water rise. That's the idea of densitometry. Okay? You run water in the bathtub and you get in the bath and the water rises. Okay? My daughter has a hard time with this. Right? We spill a lot of water out of the bathtub for various reasons when I was sitting around. Although, like yesterday, she got up in the morning and she took a shower all by herself. And Dad cried a little bit on the inside. Right? And so, these sort of milestones. I think she did a terrible job. I don't think she was very clean when she took a shower all by herself. I was like, ooh, okay. Right? But The idea of densitometry is you are made up of things. And those things give you some weight and some density, but you also have a certain body size. You have a volume of space that you occupy. And when we put you into water, you displace that water based upon, right, your volume. Okay, your volume, and then your density. You can displace the water, but then also the more dense you are, the more you're going to sink, the more you're going to weigh underwater. I think it's the other way around. The less dense you are, the easier it is for you to float when you get in the pool. Okay? If you ever try to see a 5-year-old in a pool, they sink, right? Because they have no body fat, right? And they don't have that much muscle or even that much bone mineral density, but they don't have anything to make them more buoyant. Fat floats, right? Everything else either is neutrally buoyant or muscle and bone want to sink. And so that's this idea of densitometry. So if we know your volume and we know how much water you displace, we know to what extent you might want to sink, we can guesstimate your body. That's the idea of densitometry. Okay. And that is how we have initially kind of tried to validate an assessment. Adipose tissue, lipid tissue, has a density of 0.9 grams per cubic centimeter. Okay, that number will mean nothing to you guys other than water. 1 milliliter of water weighs 1 gram. Okay, so water has a density of 1.0. Lipid tissue has a density less than water, therefore it will float. Okay, muscle has a density of 1.1. Protein is 1.1 grams per cubic centimeter. So muscle wants to sink. Bone is even higher. Bone is definitely going to sink. Okay, so if we can figure out what your density is, okay, relative to water, we can guesstimate how much sort of muscle and everything else and fat has to be in you to get us to that density level. So it's just an algebraic equation. Okay. And to do that, we use an equation that I want you all to know the name of. It's called the Seery equation. And it tells us that body fat percentage is 495 divided by your body density minus 450. Okay. I'm not going to make you do a calculation. You don't have to memorize what the equation is. Google will be happy to tell it to you. But I do want you to know that the equation we use to go from body density to percent body fat is the Seery equation. Now, there are other equations, right? Because again, we're scientists. Let's take the thing that works perfectly well and make it a little bit different. There are other equations and things that the numbers are slightly different, but you know, you get to the same place. Okay. So we typically get at density by, in the most accurate way, putting you in a tank of water and having you sit on a scale in a tank of water. We dump you under the water and then sit on a scale so we can see how much you weigh. Okay? If you weigh more underwater, that means you're more dense. There's more things pulling you down, making you sink, rather than making you float. Okay? And so that's the principle of underwater weight. Okay? And so what you can have here, we have Jack on the left and Dave on the right, or what I like to call college age Chris and current age Chris on the right here on all of this. Same height, same weight. Very different body composition. Okay? Very different body composition. And because my man Jack has more muscle, he weighs more underwater. Even though outside of the water, they both weigh 205 pounds. Okay? And so from that, we can calculate their densities and we can then figure out what their percent body fat is. Anybody who has a prescription or exercise physiology lab, you guys do underwater weighing this year? Some years we fill the tank up and we do it, some years we don't. When I was in grad school, the undergrad classes and all of them had to do underwater weighing. He made everybody do it. It's a very strange sensation to have to blow all the air out of your lungs, then hold your breath, and then go like underwater and sit there for like 20 seconds. Very claustrophobic feeling. At Georgia, we had the underwater weighing tank is actually above ground, it's this giant like, plexiglass tank. So you could see out at these. And I felt like that was like slightly less terrifying in some ways, whereas ours is it's just a hole and you go down in the ground, it's got tile and all of it, it's like a freaking bathroom. It looks and feels like if you've seen Silence of the Lambs, it's the hole in the ground where the guy puts people in on all of that. So we don't always do it every year. That's the idea. Okay. You can't just do this in a bathtub. You've got to be able to get yourself all the way, sort of all the way. But what we're measuring is not just the water that you displace upwards, but there's a scale, and we measure how much you weigh. Okay. So there's some limitations to this. All our indirect measures that don't involve imaging. This is probably the best one, the most accurate one. Okay. But we know that there's going to be variation, right, between what your fat-free mass is made up of, water, mineral, protein. So we make an assumption that like an average person, it's going to be this, okay? So bone density is the big thing along with total body water that varies. And so we know very clearly that different people have different densities of bone, and that causes us some trouble with our estimation, okay? So densitometry is not as valid for children, for women, older individuals, and some athletes because of the marked differences in body water and bone minerals. Okay. So it can be difficult and time consuming to do all of this. So we have, for the most part, we've gotten away from doing densitometry. We've gotten away from doing it. Most of the time now we just put you into Excel from scanning. The IRB will allow us to get real freaked out with its radiation. Many of you guys have ever done one with us, ladies, if they pregnancy test beforehand. We have had a moment where we were doing a study where we could tell someone that they were pregnant and they did not know it. So I will never forget my PhD student coming and being like, the pregnancy test was positive, what do I do? It was like, okay, well, we need to go talk to this person and tell them they need to go to the doctor. Right, because it could be wrong, but I don't think it was. All right, we'll pick up. So what we're gonna talk about on Monday is if there are problems in how we estimate these things, how we make it happen.
And don't forget the assignment 14 is due tonight, 11:59.
Today. Give you guys credit for showing up in the rain. Yes, I got it. Okay, you come out. Thank you. So was just asking people to put down like some ways we measure body composition and what we think that actually tells us. So put that together really fast and email it to us. And that will be good. Thank you. Thank you. Looking through.